Welcome back, my friends, to the motorbike show that never ends. It's hello from him, and it's hello from Sasha the Guzzy Dog. Say hello. There you go. Even if it was a whisper, you did get a hello. Let's talk about gearing. Now, something surprised me the other day. I was watching number 45's YouTube channel, and he was trying to work out something about the gearing on his Norton Model 50 350cc bike that he was rebuilding, and some of the things that had been done by the dreaded previous owner. Anyways, a couple of comments indicated that people had no idea what gear ratios were all about, and probably a reflection of the way things are these days, where nobody seems to want to get involved in the technical details of the things that they ride on the road. They regard bikes more like a washing machine or a dishwasher, like, you know, buy it because it looks good, does the job, and then when it doesn't work anymore, trade it and get a new one, or when you don't like it anymore, get a new one. So anyway, back in the day when I started, I used to pore over the motorbike magazines, and they had all kinds of information like this. Well, this isn't a magazine, but it kind of shows you what they had. You know, they had things like the dimensions of the bike, had performance. Now look at this, top speed 126 mile an hour. Okay, fuel consumption 45 US gallons, 45 miles per gallon US. La-di-da-di-da. We have the standard start quarter mile speed, braking distances. Now, going further down, we have the gear ratios. Can you see that? We have the gear ratios. Now, these are the gears inside the box. What does that all mean? And what is this? Primary reduction rate, final reduction rate, overall drive ratio. Blimey. And then other stuff, you know, tire sizes, which they still have. But we used to, you know, we used to thrive on this stuff. Top speed, that's the first thing we looked at. Can't do that anymore. Can't talk about speed anymore. Right, so gears. Let's get back to gears. What does this all mean, and why do we need gears? Well, back in the old days, motorbikes were just motorized bicycles. They had a little engine at the which was bolted to the frame, and then they had some means of transmitting the power from the engine to the rear wheel. Now that could be a belt, a flat belt, or a V-belt like this one, only longer. In some cases chain, but early on not many chains. Right. What in effect you had was a single cylinder engine like this chainsaw. In fact, you could actually bolt this to a motorbike frame and you could drive the rear wheel with it, and there are kits available where you can do that. So if you put a sprocket or a pulley, in our case we've got a spare sprocket, so we put that on the engine and then we use a chain to drive the rear wheel, or we use a belt, either a flat belt or a V-belt. So that's basically what a motorbike is. Now, this is what we've got. Now, to get this bike going, you still had your bike pedals here, and what you would do is you would pedal as hard as you could, then you would wait for the engine to fire up, and once the engine was firing and at speed, it would propel you forward and take over from the pedals, which would then just freewheel. And when you came to a hill, and this thing might do 30 mile an hour, when you came to a hill, it didn't have the power to get up it. So you'd have to jump off and either pedal assist, or you had pedal assist the bike, or you'd have to jump off and push the bike up the hill. Not a very good scenario. So then they thought about adding another pulley, either to the engine or to the rear wheel, in which case you would have a short gear for when you were riding up and down the hills of Derbyshire, and then when you got onto the flat, easy fields of Nottinghamshire, you would then swap your belt over to a different pulley and pull a different ratio, which would mean you would have a higher top speed, but you still would, if you came to a steep hill, you'd either have to get off or you'd have to put the belt onto a different pulley to get up that hill. Now, not all belts were like that one. Some of them were made up of sections of leather with a rivet here and then a slotted piece, so you could actually push it down and take it off. So you could add or take away leather sections to fit your various pulleys. Very laborious thing to have to do. So it wasn't long before the motorbike companies started to make gearboxes. And what gearboxes enabled you to do was to give you the ratio so that your little engine could pull you up the hills. Now initially there were 2 speeds, and then they went to 3 speeds, and then by the time of the Second World War we were talking about 4-speed boxes. But anyway, let's look at how it works. We've got our engine, and on the end of the crankshaft of the engine there's a sprocket or a gear. So on this engine here we've got our crankshaft, goes along there, sticks out here. In this case we've got a gear, but we could equally have a sprocket, and as that sprocket turns, it turns the clutch here. Now the clutch is a way of engaging the drive. I don't want to talk too much about clutches, but let's say you notice that this doesn't move. What the clutch does, it allows the drive to be disengaged. So when you let the clutch lever out, the drive is engaged and the whole thing turns like that. You pull the clutch lever in, this turns, that stays still. If you look at the other end of the gearbox, as I turn the clutch center, the gearbox turns, right? So if everything is wedged up tight, everything turns and the gearbox sprocket turns, and that drives the back wheel. Now within this gearbox there are 5 gears, and they're arranged in pairs. Power comes in on one shaft, turns that gear, which engages with another, which then the power is transmitted out to this one and back to the rear wheel. So theoretically speaking, this is how it works with a 3-speed box. So we've got 2 gears here. We've got a 5 and a 15, 8 and a 12, a 10 and a 10. So if we divide the 15 by 5, we get 3. So we've got a 3-to-1 ratio there. We divide the 12 by 8, we've got a 1.5-to-1 ratio there, and 10 divided by 10 is 1. So on the primary side, if we've got a 20-tooth sprocket or a 22-tooth gear here, a 40-tooth sprocket and a 40-tooth gear, we've got a reduction of 2-to-1. And when the power comes out the gearbox, it has to be taken to the back wheel. So what we're looking at here is a 15-tooth. That is actually a 15-tooth. And then that goes via chain to the rear wheel sprocket, this thing. And in our case, we're looking at a 45-tooth sprocket. So 15 into 45 is 3. So we've got our reduction of 3-to-1. Now, the book talks about overall reduction, overall drive ratio, and that's what's important. That's what dictates how the bike behaves. A good first gear will give you enough power from the engine to take off smoothly, and a top gear should be suitable for the engine to give you a good cruising speed without laboring the engine too much. Obviously, the bigger the engine, the higher the gear you can pull. So to work out the overall ratios, what you do is you multiply the reductions. So we've got our primary reduction of 2-to-1, so we've got a 2. We've got our secondary reduction in first gear of 3-to-1, so there's 3. and then the final reduction of 3 to 1. 3. So 2 times 3 times 3 is 18. So our first gear ratio, overall ratio, is 18 to 1. Now for our top gear, in which case it's a 3-speed box, we've got a 1 to 1 reduction in top. So we've still got our primary and we've still got the final. So we've got our primary at 2, the intermediate in the gearbox at 1, and our final reduction of 3. So 2 times 1 times 3, that's 6 to 1. Okay, so that gives us our ratios. So when people talk about a top gear ratio or a third gear ratio, in this case 6 to 1, first gear 18 to 1. Now as you know, I'm a Guzzi fan. Guzzi's and shaft drive bikes are a little different. Now I'm going to leave out the cross the frame shaft drive bikes for now. Just going to talk about Guzzi's, BMWs and the Triumph Rocket 3, which have an engine with a crankshaft longitudinal to the frame. In these cases, the clutch is bolted directly to the flywheel, just like a car or a pickup truck. And then we have a shaft which goes straight into the gearbox. So on this side, outside the gearbox, we don't have a primary reduction. We don't have this. We have it instead inside the gearbox. So we've got a pair of gears here. In our case, we've got a 7-tooth and a 14-tooth. So that gives us a 2 to 1. We've got our same ratios as we have here. 5 and 15, 8 and 12, 10 and 10. Right, and then the drive comes out the back of the gearbox, and on the end of the shaft here we have a pinion gear and a crown wheel gear which is attached to the rear wheel. So this is the arrangement we've got there. We've got a pinion gear and we've got a crown wheel gear, and then these drive the rear wheel. So as the shaft from the gearbox turns, it turns a crown wheel, which turns the rear wheel. Okay, so this turns fast and that turns slow. Okay, so that is how it works on a shaft drive bike. Again, we can work out our ratios. Our primary is 14 and 7, which is 2. Our first gear 15 and 5, sorry, which is 3 to 1. And our final reduction is 8 teeth. 8 teeth on our pinion and 32 teeth on our crown wheel, so that gives us a 4 to 1. So we multiply them, we get 2 times 3 times 4. So our first gear in this case is 24 to 1, which is a shorter gear than the 18 to 1. And our top gear is 8 to 1, where that one was 6 to 1. So all in all, because of the lower ratio here, we've got, instead of a 3 to 1, we've got a 4 to 1. We brought everything down a tad. Okay, so that's how our overall ratio works. Now, how do we know what gears to use? Well, let's look in this old book. Great book. They used to have them in the old days so that you could buy these and fix your bike. Imagine that. Now, from there, I drew these figures out of a chart, and it's models from 1940 to 1960 Royal Enfield. Now, the War Department Royal Enfield was a 125cc. It only had 3 gears. Very low powered bike. Just a little bike for puttering around town or up the country lanes. Our ratios, first gear overall 23 to 1. And our top gear 7.85 to 1. So this bike is low powered, not going anywhere fast. The top gear that it will pull is about that. If you give it any more, if you go lower than that, if you go to 5 or 4, it ain't going to pull it. Let's go to the War Department CO model, which is a 350. And now we're looking at a first gear ratio of 18.6 and a top gear of 5.6. So more power. We've got the torque to take off in a taller gear ratio than that, and then it's also got enough power to pull a taller ratio than that. So we're looking at 5.65 18.6. Now the top gear speed is, the top gear ratio that we choose is to obtain the kind of speed that we're looking at. On the roads of the day weren't very good, so we couldn't go too fast anyway, but we also want to be within the power range of the engine, so that was okay. Going to the Bullet in 1955, more power, so it'll pull a taller first gear, it'll pull 15.8, but because of the roads of the day and various other aspects, we're still looking at 5.6. Now, a virtually identical bike, but with a slightly bigger engine, is the 55 Bullet. More torque, more power. So we can take off with a taller first gear. We're looking at 13.6. And it'll also pull a taller top gear, 4.9. So more power, more torque, away we go. Now, if we jump ahead to 58, which is the first year of the Constellation. Constellation is a 700, which is basically two 350 Bullet barrels and heads side by side. We can pull a 12.4, so we can pull a higher ratio in first, and our top speed, our top gear is 4.44 again, which is higher than those. We've got the power, we've got the torque, we can pull a higher ratio, we can go faster easily. Jump ahead to the 1970 Interceptor. We've still got the same first gear, we've still got the same top gear, but they did change the middle ratios just a tiny bit, just to make the engine a little bit more tractable. We've got less of a jump between second and third. Now, how does that compare to a modern Interceptor? 650 instead of the 750. Well, the E5 has got these ratios: 13.6 first gear and almost a 5 top gear. So we're pulling a shorter ratio than the old Interceptor. Not only that, but the first gear, we're giving ourselves, we've geared it down. We geared it down to 13.6. So this bike was kicking out, I don't know, 56, 58 horsepower. This one does about 45. So because of the reduced power, we've got to go with a shorter first gear and a shorter top gear. It just doesn't have the oomph that the 750 had, even though it's got 6 gears. Wow. Okay, so let's look at some other bikes. Now, originally I wanted to get a Guzzi for the shaft drive, and I wanted to replace my Suzuki V-Strom, which was a fantastic bike, ultra reliable, very comfortable bike to ride for long distances, but it used to eat chains and sprockets. So I wanted to go shaft, so the Breva was the only thing I could find. So I bought it, and I was disappointed initially because of the first gear. I felt that the first gear was way too tall. The bike was snatchy in first gear, and although it got better after I adjusted the throttle bodies, it wasn't the way I liked it. It wasn't really what I wanted. And I looked at the gear ratios, and I had an 11:1 first gear, which is kind of tall. I mean, look at it compared to the Interceptor and the Constellation, 12.4. So she's much taller geared. Now, is that a good thing? Well, for the use I wanted to put the bike to, which is riding on some rough roads, etc., I wanted to be able to go slow, easily, and this was not the bike for that. This bike is more suited to the open road. Look at our top gear, 4.2. Wow. Compare it to a modern Moto Guzzi, the V85 TT. We got a first gear of 12.8, which is more like our Interceptor and our Constellation. We've got a top gear of 4.6, which is slightly lower than the Interceptor. Jump up to the brand new bike, the V100 Mandello and Stelvio, which incidentally have the same gearing. This is the road, this is the adventure bike. We're looking at almost the same gears. Look at that. So Guzzi have tried these gears out on their off-road bike and they know they work, and they've given the new bike something similar. Where can you find these figures? Not easily. You have to really look for them. Now then, my Tiger, my big Tiger. None of this information was available to me. My initial impressions of the bike was it was fantastic, loads of power, burn up the road like you would not believe. But I didn't like the first gear. It felt like my brother. Why is that? Well, let's look at the gearing. So eventually was able to find the gearing and work out the overall ratios, and this is what I got. My first gear is 11.7. The top gear is 4.59, which actually the top gear is not bad, but she's limited in top gear. There's a speed limiter on it, so that is pretty academic anyway. I would almost hazard a guess to say that she's just as fast in 5th as 6th. But why 11.7? Why did they do that? Well, let's look at the BMW 1250 GS. And what do we see? We see a lot of similarity. A lot of similarity. The same first gear ratio. Why? Why did Triumph do this? I think they copied BMW. Don't sue me, Triumph. That's just my opinion, in my opinion. Now, our top gear is taller than that, and I think that is an indication of the fact that the BMW engine is more torquey. The Triumph engine in 1200 is more powerful than that, but this is more torquey, so she will pull a higher top gear. Be more relaxed in top gear, slightly. But when you're talking about power of these two bikes, that's about 148, this is about 125. You've got more power than you need. Now then, the new Beamer, what do they do with that? Well, look at the first gear. Did somebody give their head a shake and come up with something more sensible? There's not a lot of difference between the other gears, but look at that first gear. That's your crawler gear. That's your gear for going down a rocky trail at walking pace. That's your gear for powering through mud, etc. That's the one. That is a way better gear than either of those two. So I'm not a BMW fan, but well done BMW there. Okay, so that's our gears. We've talked about ratios and why we have them. We've talked about some of the bikes and what gear ratios they have. Now let's look at other bikes. Let's look at a new bike that's come onto the market, the Himalayan 452. These are the figures for that bike. Primary of just over 2, final drive of just over 3. Internal ratios of these. Now our final drive is achieved by a 15-tooth sprocket here, 15-tooth here, and a 47-tooth here. That gives us an overall ratio of 6.35. Now you times that and you get that. Now if we go in to our gearbox and we work out our ratios, we get a first gear overall ratio of 19.6, which is vastly in excess of these. So that indicates to me that this bike is good for going through difficult terrain at low speed. Look at our top gear, our overall ratio is 6. So although that is lower than these, not by a whole lot, it's like 4th on the Stelvio. Okay, now this bike's 40 horsepower. You can't expect it to pull the ratios that this bike will pull. This bike's 115, that's 148, that's about 125, and that's about 146, I think. So the 450 will not pull those kind of ratios, but I believe it's got a bloody good selection of gears that are suited to the job it has to do. Now if you were to change the gearing, if you were to jump up from a 15 on the gearbox to a 16, this is a 16, it's not much, that would affect the ratio as follows. Your first gear would now be 18.4 overall and your top gear would be 5.7. So if you're going to be doing road work more, then that might be a thing to do. I've done that on loads of bikes, not the Himalayan because I don't have one, but I've done that on loads of bikes. You can alter the gearing up or down. If you change one tooth on here, very often you don't have to shorten the lengthen the chain or anything. Now, okay, so that's good off-road, but how good is it? How does it compare to something like a trials bike? Well, let's go back to the 1970s to a Bultaco 350 Sherpa T. Very, very successful bike, probably the best bike of its era. Our first gear is 38 to 1, and our top gear is 9.5. Our second gear is almost 30 to 1. So these are the gears that we do our nidgery-nadgery stuff, dodging through the rocks and stream beds where we want to go slow, take our time, but we don't want to be riding the clutch. We want to be using the bike engine as braking. Say we're coming down a steep hill. We don't want to be using the clutch because this is in the days before ABS, etc., etc. These are our road gears we use for getting from section to section. Okay, we might only be able to do 45 miles an hour, but that's okay. Now then, if we want to go a little more off-road, if we go to the Alpina 250 of the same, roughly the same era, slightly earlier because it's only got a 4-speed box, what we're looking at here is a first gear of 23, top gear of 8. So it's going to be still slower than the Himalayan, but the top gear is going to be slower too. Okay, jump up a bit more to the Matador, which was the International 6 Days Trial type of bike, which had to be the sum of these two, if you like, and then also had to do some fairly fast road work. So we're looking at a first gear of 27 and a top gear of 7.9. So a little bit faster than that, and then a little bit slower than that. So a good range of gears here, but first is exceptionally low for trials type sections. Okay, so is the Himalayan going to be good for what it's designed to do? I think it's going to be excellent. Alright, so how does that compare? How do the other popular bikes compare? Their gear ratios. Name me 3 popular off-road bikes, adventure bikes. Africa Twin, Yamaha T7 700 Tenere, and 900 Triumph. Couldn't find any ratios for the KTMs. There is a limit to how much time I can spend on this. Anyway, so now we're looking at our ratios. The 1100 Africa Twin's got 100 horsepower, pretty pokey engine, not as pokey as the BM or the 1200, but still way up there. Same power as the V-Strom, which had lots. So we're looking at our first gear ratio of 13 to 1, which compares very well with the V85 TT and the Mandela. It's right there. Sixth gear, again, very comparable. Oh, I can't find it right now. Very comparable. Very comparable. 4.4. That's very similar to the top gear on the Royal Enfield Interceptor. So looking at a useful set of gears here. Again, you can change the sprockets. You can bring that down. You could get that down to 14 to 1 if you want. And that's kind of what I think I might do if I had one. Now the DCT, which is the automatic version, is geared higher. It's geared taller rather. So we're looking at a 4 to 1 top gear and an 11.5 to 1 first gear, which I think is too tall. So this DCT automatic is more of your road going bike, which is what I think it'll be used for mostly, and then your manual is this, which I think is a good selection of gears and be made even better by changing your final drive. Yamaha 700 T7 Tenere, we got a first gear of 16.8 and a top gear of 5.7. Ideal. I think this bike has got a reputation for being very good off-road or on rough terrain, rough roads. It's not super powerful, it's 70 horsepower. I think 70 horsepower coupled with these ratios is right there. You could alter it a little by a tooth here or a tooth there. But very good ratios, I think, and that's why that bike has got such a good reputation. Tiger 900. How does that compare to the 1200? Well, we've got a shorter first gear. We've got a 13.5. Again, I think that is ideally suited for a general all-round bike that will go off-road. And a top gear of about 5, and I think that is good too. Now you could go up a tooth or down a tooth on the gearbox sprocket to change these, or you could go for a larger or smaller rear sprocket. So you could fine tune this bike to give it what you want, which I think is good. I mean, it's very comparable to the Honda in terms of power, etc., etc. Horses for courses. And I think that is all I want to talk about. Oh, just as a matter of interest, how does my poor old Eldorado fit into it? Well, these are the gear ratios in the Eldorado, and she is geared tall. She's okay on the open road, but she does not like going slow in traffic, and that's because we've got an 11.4 first gear and a 4.2 fifth gear. They're both too tall. You know, if we were looking at a 12.4 here, I think we'd be much better off. And a 4.4 here, same as the Interceptor. Isn't it funny how an 850 touring bike and a 750 Interceptor performance bike produce about the same amount of power and need the same gearing? If this was geared the same as the Interceptor, in my opinion, would be a better bike. Not a bad bike, it's a beautiful bike. But she is geared tall, and she's more comfortable in fourth than fifth. Compare that to the new version, the V7 850. These are your gears. We've got a 12.8, and we're coming to the magic 12.5 to 13 for a road bike. We're right there. Our top gear is 4.5 to 1. Just slightly down off the 4.4 from the Interceptor and Constellation. So we're looking at another good set of gears here. You know, Moto Guzzi thought about it, gave that bike the right gears for its 65 horsepower. This bike is also 65 horsepower, but I bet this bike rides easier than mine. So there we are. I think gears are important, gear ratios are important, and it pays to study them. And I just wish that these people who are testing bikes would look into it more, and the people who write the specifications for the bikes, for the makers themselves, would delve into it a bit more, because some of these figures are very hard to find. And it doesn't look much, it's just a few sheets of paper, but it took me an awful long time to find out them gear ratios and put them in a form that I think people can understand. Now, as regards changing ratios, we talked about changing the gearbox sprocket. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to change the rear wheel sprocket. Or you could, on some models of bike, you could change the engine sprocket, like on Nortons and things like that. You can change that, and that's why the old-time racers used to run with open primaries, because they'd very often change the primary reduction. And the reason they did that was because companies like Norton would produce brakes like this, which had an integral, where the sprocket and the brake drum were one. If you wore out the sprocket, you'd have to buy a new brake drum. There's no means of separating them, no means of changing your gearing easily. Now, BSA was slightly better in that you could take the sprocket off the brake drum. And that's why you see more competitions and special bikes with BSA quickly detachable rear hubs on them. They're good for their day. They were excellent. These are easy. You just unbolt this, put a different sprocket on, and away you go. So that's it. On chain driven bikes, you've got lots of options for changing your gearing to get the optimal. On shaft driven bikes, like my Guzzi, you don't have an option because you've got a crown wheel and pinion. The only thing you can do is put a sidecar crown wheel and pinion in, but that might be too big a jump down. So there we go. It's been a very long video. I hope you managed to stick around to the end. If you did, thank you very, very much. Hope you understand a little bit more about gear ratios, how they work, and although they are a little daunting at first, they're really very, very simple. So when you're considering a bike, look at the gear ratios and decide if they're going to be suitable for what you want to do. You don't want a 1000cc road bike with a 38:1 gear ratio, and neither do you want a 450 bike with a very tall first gear ratio. So until next time, it's goodbye from him. Sasha Dog has got bored and deserted us. Take care of yourselves, look after one another. Bye for now.